have told you about this accuser before. She says she was raped by P. Diddy at a private home in the Bay Area in 2018. She says that she doesn't believe the police ever investigated her reports. Multiple agencies, not just one, three. But now we are hearing so much more detail, and actually a level of detail almost unmatched in a lot of complaints that I've read through. I'm actually going to read a lot of the details in just a moment, and I'm going to do it verbatim, and so I need to give you a massive flashing red warning here. What I'm about to say is quite disturbing. There's a lot of uncomfortable language, and if you are triggered or upset by sex assaults and violent assaults, etc., then this is definitely not the show for you tonight. The accuser is named Ashley Parham, and she has agreed to allow her name to be made public. Let's be real clear about that. She is going public with her name. She says that in February of 2018, she met a man named Shane Pierce at a bar, and that Shane FaceTimed Diddy outside on the sidewalk, apparently trying to impress her. But Ashley Parham says that she told both Shane and Diddy on FaceTime that she wasn't impressed. And this is important. She says she believed that Diddy had something to do with the murder of Tupac Shakur, and said as much. Allegedly, Diddy warned her that she would pay for saying something like that. Let's just fast forward now to a month later, where she says this guy Shane invited her to come to his apartment. And the lawsuit says, quote, plaintiff and defendant Shane then began to watch a movie, and defendant Shane offered her a glass of water, which he retrieved and brought back to the plaintiff. A few minutes later, Ashley Parham says that P. Diddy showed up with an entourage, including his top aide, Christina Coram, an unnamed woman who is not a defendant in the suit, and three unnamed men, one of whom she says was Diddy's driver, and Parham says that that driver waited outside throughout the whole of what I'm about to tell you. Parham says that Diddy was antagonistic from the start, and that he put a knife to her face. And now this is where I start reading directly from the complaint. Defendant Shane then partially undressed plaintiff, and then defendant Diddy removed the remainder of plaintiff's clothing, removing the knife from her face, and then retrieved a bottle of liquid from a large fanny pack. Defendant Diddy then squirted a bottle of liquid on plaintiff, which placed her in fear that she was being squirted with a chemical substance like acid. Plaintiff soon realized the substance was an oil/lubricant. Plaintiff was squirted with this liquid substance all over the entirety of her naked body. Defendant KK was then told by defendant Diddy to insert what looked like a syringe from sterile packaging into plaintiff's vagina. What? KK did as told, and then told defendant Diddy that she was unable to use the IUD because it had prematurely been released from its packaging, and an IUD is a birth control device. Defendant Diddy, upset by this, took the so-called syringe from defendant KK and tried inserting it into plaintiff's vagina instead. Defendant KK and Diddy began to argue as defendant KK continued to advise defendant Diddy that since the IUD had been prematurely released from its packaging, there was no way they could insert it into plaintiff's vagina effectively. After some time, defendant Diddy heeded the advice of defendant KK and removed the syringe from plaintiff's vagina and handed it to defendant KK. Defendants KK and Jane Doe then exited defendant Shane's residence, leaving the plaintiff alone with defendants Diddy, Shane, and Doe's number 1 and 2. Defendant Diddy then picked up a television remote that was near to plaintiff and violently inserted it into plaintiff's vagina. Defendant Diddy, while violently raping plaintiff with a television remote, told plaintiff that her life was in his hands and that if he wanted, he could, quote, take her, and she would never be seen again. Plaintiff began hysterically crying from the threats by Diddy, along with the pain of being violently, vaginally raped by defendant Diddy with the television remote, as well as the lingering pain from the ordeal with the IUD syringe insertion. Defendant Diddy then instructed defendant Shane to turn plaintiff on her stomach, seemingly tired of hearing plaintiff's blood-curdling cries. Defendant Shane then grabbed plaintiff by her abdomen and hips and turned plaintiff on her stomach. Defendant Diddy then instructed defendant Shane to put a pillow over her head because he didn't want to see her face or hear her cries, and instructed defendant Shane to anally rape plaintiff. Defendant Shane did as he was told by defendant Diddy and began to anally rape plaintiff. Defendant Diddy then violently raped plaintiff anally after defendant Shane. Defendant Doe number 2 then joined defendants Diddy and Shane, taking a turn anally raping plaintiff. Immediately after defendant number 2 raped plaintiff, he exited defendant Shane's residence. Defendant Diddy then instructed defendant Doe number 1 to also rape plaintiff. Instead of immediately raping plaintiff, defendant Doe number 1 doused plaintiff with more oil/lubricant on top of plaintiff's naked and oiled body, treating it like a slip and slide and knocking the wind out of plaintiff due to his enormous size. Defendant Doe number 1 then caught himself from sliding over plaintiff's oiled body and off the bed, and then began raping plaintiff vaginally. While defendant number 1 was raping plaintiff, defendant Diddy sat in a chair near the bed and began masturbating while recording plaintiff's rape by defendant Doe number 1. Another party's phone fell on the bed near plaintiff. Plaintiff then attempted to grab the phone, but it slipped out of her hands and onto the floor due to the oil/lubricant that had been doused all over her person by defendants Diddy and Doe number 1. Defendant Diddy began laughing at plaintiff's attempt to grab the phone. Throughout this violent gangbang-style rape, defendant Diddy made constant belittling remarks to plaintiff, including that he, quote, owned her now. Plaintiff's body was becoming more and more limp over the course of the violent rape until eventually she had no control over her body, nor could she move her body. When defendant Doe number 1 finished raping plaintiff, defendant KK entered the room to examine the condition of plaintiff, who was barely able to move or control her bodily functions. Defendant KK examined plaintiff to see if she needed assistance and was about to give plaintiff an IV fluid. Plaintiff cannot be certain if she did or did not receive such intravenous intervention. Defendant KK then opened a different bag, different than the one that Diddy removed the oil from, where plaintiffs observed several medicine bottles, IV fluid bags, and other unidentified powder-like drugs. Defendant KK then removed a pill from one of the medicine bottles and gave it to defendant Diddy. Defendant Diddy then inserted the pill into plaintiff's mouth and down her throat, to where plaintiff had no choice but to ingest the unknown pill. Defendants Diddy, Shane, KK, and Doe number 1 then exited the residence to the backyard, where they smoked marijuana and cigarettes. Plaintiff remained in an almost lifeless state in defendant Shane's bedroom until she finally regained her bodily functions. Plaintiff then began looking for her clothes and her purse that contained her car keys and cell phone, but could not discover them in the room or anywhere in the apartment. Plaintiff was only able to find a t-shirt on the floor, which she put on to cover her naked body. Plaintiff also observed a black condom wrapper on the floor of the bedroom, which she assumed was used by one of the defendants, most likely defendant Diddy, during the rape. Plaintiff then grabbed a knife from the kitchen and headed to the backyard where defendants were smoking, as that was the only way to exit the premises onto the street. Plaintiff concealed the knife on her left side as she exited the apartment to the backyard area. Upon coming to the exit of the home, which led to the backyard, plaintiff was met by defendant Doe number 1, who was standing at the door between the residence and the backyard. Defendant Doe number 1 did not see the knife the plaintiff concealed on her left side, as it was obstructed by the oversized t-shirt that the plaintiff was wearing. Plaintiff observed defendant Diddy still partially nude from the assault, while defendants Shane and Doe number 1 had on their clothing. Defendant Shane then left to the upstairs portion of the patio/balcony where defendants KK and Jane Doe were already situated. Plaintiff then sat down on a makeshift seat in the backyard when defendant Diddy noticed her presence and remarked that he was surprised she was able to walk because he had given her, quote, enough drugs to take out a horse, end quote. Whoa. Plaintiff then asked defendant Diddy what he gave her, and he laughed and did not provide a response. Defendant Diddy then made further comments to plaintiff in a jovial, friendly manner, asking her why, quote, they hadn't partied together before, because it was, quote, so much fun, and he, quote, hadn't had any blank that tight in a while. Plaintiff then told Diddy she did not party with him, and she did not enjoy partying with him, and that he'd raped her. Defendant Diddy did not like plaintiff's response to his lighthearted commentary and offered plaintiff money and instructed plaintiff to say that the violent rape was consensual and that plaintiff was a sex worker. Plaintiff became enraged and yelled at defendant Diddy that her rape was not consensual, she was not a sex worker, and she refused to take any money from him and would tell the police that he raped her. Defendant Diddy then told plaintiff no one would ever believe she'd been raped by him, and if she did tell anyone such, that they would harm her family. Defendant Doe number 1 then showed the plaintiff his phone, which looked as if it was the outside of plaintiff's estranged sister's residence, and she could see her sister sitting on a couch and her sister's spouse on the balcony. It looked as if someone was outside the residence streaming this video to defendant Doe number 1's phone. Plaintiff was rattled by what she was seeing on defendant Doe number 1's phone and was still angry about being gang raped and was not complying with defendant Diddy's request to take the money being offered to say that the rape was consensual. Defendant Diddy then called his mother in an effort to further convince plaintiff not to report her assault. Defendant Diddy's mother yelled at plaintiff to not hurt her son. Plaintiff told defendant Diddy's mother that her son had violently raped plaintiff. Defendant Diddy's mother, seemingly unfazed by the statement, then continued her demands with plaintiff to take the money being offered and not report the rape to law enforcement. Defendant Diddy then made further threats that he had, quote, gotten off from bigger crimes than this, and referred to Tupac again, further antagonizing the plaintiff. Now here is where, from the complaint, that the people who were present now in this backyard begin to turn on one another, and then it looks like they start fighting with one another. So the complaint continues this way. Defendant Doe number 1 then turned to defendant Diddy and pulled his gun on him, asking Diddy to repeat what he'd said in reference to Tupac. As the two of them were exchanging words, plaintiff went behind defendant Doe number 1, where he seemingly began to protect plaintiff. Defendant Doe number 1 then advanced to defendant Diddy, questioning him over the comments that he'd made about Tupac. During this commotion, a neighbor directly across the street came outside and peered into the backyard and asked what all the commotion was about. Defendant Doe number 1 then pointed the gun at the neighbor and instructed the neighbor to mind his business and return to his residence. Defendant Doe number 1 then turned the gun back on defendant Diddy. Plaintiff, not far behind defendant Doe number 1, then tried to grab defendant Doe number 1's hand that was holding the gun. The gun then went off and hit a hill behind defendant Shane's residence. Defendant Diddy then ran up the back stone stairs near the hill in the backyard towards where defendants KK, Shane, and Jane Doe were. Plaintiff then charged towards defendant Diddy, moving the concealed knife from her left hand to her right hand and in pursuit of defendant Diddy. Plaintiff then pushed defendant Diddy from behind while on the stone stairs outside, causing him to fall with his back to plaintiff. Plaintiff then raised the knife in a rage from the events that had just transpired, and with the intent of driving the knife into Diddy's back when he turned around and began pleading for his life. Plaintiff, shocked to see defendant Diddy acting as a victim, had a moment of clarity and then turned and ran down the outdoor stone staircase back out to the backyard to escape. Defendant Diddy then chased the plaintiff down the stairs and attempted to push her, but she was already at the bottom of the stairs and gained her footing and wielded the knife at defendant Diddy, grazing his abdomen. Hearing the commotion, defendants KK and Jane Doe emerged, and defendant KK began administering first aid to defendant Diddy for the injuries caused by the plaintiff. Plaintiff tried to make a quick dash for the exit, but was thwarted by defendant Doe number 1. After a period of time, plaintiff was able to abscond from defendant Doe number 1 due to the first aid commotion with defendant Diddy and was able to run down the street. Once plaintiff made it onto the street, she began yelling loudly for someone to call the police. Defendant Doe number 1, who had now caught up with the plaintiff, advised the plaintiff that he was an undercover cop.
What?
To this day, plaintiff is unsure of the truth or falsity of that statement. The same neighbor then again emerged from his residence asking what was transpiring. Just as plaintiff was attempting to answer, gunshots began being fired in plaintiff's direction. Plaintiff fled to a car where the neighbor was also taking cover and lost sight of defendant Doe number 1. Plaintiff then heard an SUV screeching and speeding, leaving the residence. Plaintiff then entered the home of the neighbor, who informed her that he had already called the police. Plaintiff informed the neighbor that it was Sean Combs who had raped her and shot at them. But the neighbor was unaware who defendant Diddy was. Shortly thereafter, a sheriff from the Conocostra Sheriff's Department arrived at the neighbor's home. Plaintiff told the sheriff that she'd been violently gang raped by defendant Diddy and others, and that she did not have her clothes, phone, purse, car keys, or cell phone. At this point in the complaint, the accuser says that the sheriff did not offer to help her in any way. Didn't offer to call her an ambulance, didn't offer to get her home, didn't offer to get her to safety. But the complaint continues now. Plaintiff then went back to defendant Shane's residence, where she found the door open and her clothes were readily accessible in his residence. Defendant Shane then emerged as if nothing had transpired and offered for plaintiff to stay at his residence while she, quote, slept it off. Plaintiff asked for her purse and her keys, but defendant Shane told her she shouldn't leave in her condition. And plaintiff, catatonic and in a state of shock and disbelief of the events that had transpired, stayed at defendant Shane's home. Defendant Shane left the home. Later that morning, defendant Shane returned to the residence and woke plaintiff up, and finally gave her back her purse, cell phone, and keys, and plaintiff left defendant's residence. In a daze, plaintiff returned home and tried to make sense out of what had happened to her. So now on March 26, 2018, this would be the following month after this alleged incident, plaintiff contacted her primary care doctor and asked for an HIV and STD test in fear of possibly having contracted a disease from her violent rape. And we want to stop out and point that according to the complaint, Ashley Parham does not ask her own doctor for a rape kit during this visit. And according to the complaint, doesn't mention anything at all about the rape at all to her own private doctor, just asks for the STD testing.